Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por conectarse y gracias por hacer parte de esta actividad que hemos organizado con Uniminuto en el marco del Tour de la Transferencia Social Fulbright Rumbo. El día de hoy nos encontramos a través de Zoom y a través de YouTube. Voy a darles un par de indicaciones para quienes se encuentran aquí a través del Zoom. Eh, Nosotros vamos a tener una charla el día de hoy organizada por nuestra experta de Fulbright, Tasha Howe, y principalmente esta charla pues será en el idioma inglés. Ustedes pueden seleccionar una traducción simultánea en español a través de un icono de un mapa mundi donde abajo dice interpretación. Ahí pueden seleccionar esa interpretación para que sea al idioma español, donde nos acompañará pues la traducción simultánea durante la actividad. Así también les pedimos que puedan interactuar con nosotros a través del chat y en la sección de preguntas y respuestas de la siguiente forma. Teniendo en cuenta que somos varios y que la charla de Tasha pues, va a generar varias preguntas y comentarios, nos facilitaría muchísimo a nosotros que todas las preguntas que deseen hacerle a Tasha la hagan a través de la sección de preguntas y respuestas y todos los comentarios que sean de tipo nos está escuchando bien, saludos, muchas gracias, eso lo podemos hacer a través del chat. Con eso nosotros pues tenemos más organizadas las preguntas para que podamos hacérselas a Tasha al final de la actividad. La traducción simultánea también nos puede ayudar para la traducción de estas respuestas de ser necesario y pues les pedimos a todos ustedes que se mantengan muy activos a través de esta actividad para que también sea pues una charla en medio de todo interactiva y que no sea simplemente pues Tasha conversando sin tener algún tipo de respuesta. Como les decía, pues esto hace parte del gran evento que hemos organizado con Fulbright, que es el Tour de la Transferencia Social. Ustedes pueden seguir todo lo que ha pasado durante este tour a través de nuestras redes sociales, también a través de nuestra página web www.rumbo.edu.co, donde pueden ver cada uno de los temas que ha tocado Tasha hasta este momento. Llevamos 2 semanas del Tour de Transferencia Social y ha sido para nosotros un gran éxito contar con Tasha durante estas 2 semanas en actividades organizadas por nuestras universidades miembros. Ustedes también, pues les damos las gracias por organizar este encuentro del día de hoy a Uniminuto y pues vamos a darle paso ahora a Juan Mauricio Benítez, que es nuestro director ejecutivo de la red Rumbo, quien nos va a dar una introducción de este evento, pero también de cómo ha sido pues en general este tour para la red, para nuestras universidades, para Fulbright, y agradecerles pues nuevamente la participación de ustedes a través del Zoom, a través de YouTube. Quienes se encuentran en YouTube les doy la indicación que pueden enviarnos sus preguntas a través del chat ahí que genera YouTube y nosotros las haremos llegar a Tasha. En este streaming en YouTube ustedes no tienen acceso a la traducción simultánea, de modo que si lo consideran necesario, también les compartiré ahí en el chat de YouTube el enlace al Zoom para que puedan conectarse también acá. Muchas gracias nuevamente y entonces le voy a dar paso a Juan Mauricio para que nos dé inicio a esta actividad del día de hoy.
Pablo, buenos días y muchas gracias por darme este paso. Eh, Tasha, buenos días Edison y buenos días Alberto. Muchas gracias a todos los que ya están conectados y nos van a acompañar en este espacio. Nosotros desde la red académica Rumbo estamos muy contentos de estas 2 semanas ya que hemos tenido de trabajo y que de trabajo con la doctora Tasha y que nos ha mostrado y nos ha enseñado diferentes facetas, hemos hablado sobre diferentes temas, teniendo como eje principal la transferencia del conocimiento. Nosotros como red académica tenemos este es solo uno de los tantos eventos que hacemos para fortalecer el trabajo de las universidades y especialmente desde la investigación, ver cómo potencializamos todo lo que, lo que se hace en las universidades en el tema de investigación y también pues tenemos varios eventos, no solo tenemos este evento del tour de la transferencia social Rumbo, sino también tenemos otros eventos vinculados con ciudades inteligentes, con capacitación en temas de formación para investigadores. Y bueno, los invitamos a todos a conocer mucho más los diferentes proyectos que estamos desarrollando en nuestra página web www.rumbo.edu.co. Ahí pueden ver todos los proyectos que tenemos y si quieren inscribirse o ver los demás eventos que tenemos con la doctora Tasha Howe, que esta es la última semana en la que tendremos eventos con ella y con las diferentes universidades miembros, los invito a, a unirse, a revisarlo en eventos.rumbo.edu.co. No me queda más que darle la bienvenida a todos y darle la bienvenida especialmente pues también a Edison y Alberto Chamorro de la Universidad Uniminuto, quienes nos acompañan hoy. Y no sé si vayan a tener un saludo antes de que le demos paso a nuestra experta. Edison, cuéntame, por favor.
Claro que sí, Juan. Muchísimas gracias por hacernos esta apertura. Te doy también las gracias por habernos permitido este espacio con la doctora Tasha. A la doctora Tasha agradecerle por su experiencia y por su compromiso, además por todas esas enseñanzas que nos pueda dejar el día de hoy. Queremos presentar un saludo muy cordial a toda la comunidad Uniminuto y externa Uniminuto. En este momento se encuentran conectados con nosotros algunos directores, docentes, estudiantes y otras personas que probablemente tienen muchísimo interés en esto que estamos construyendo desde Uniminuto, que es la innovación social. Entonces, bienvenidos a este encuentro y le damos entonces paso a la doctora Tasha Hope. Sin embargo, si me permiten, antes quisiera hacer una breve introducción de qué es Uniminuto.
Sí, hagamos una cosa de eso porque Tasha, calculo que eso también lo hace especialmente para Tasha porque la mayoría del público es de ustedes. Entonces le voy a pedir a Tasha que se conecte al canal y cuando le vayas a dar paso, dale paso a Pablo para que nos presente el perfil completo de Tasha. Tasha, right now Edison is going to introduce you to Uniminuto, Universidad Uniminuto. So I would like to ask you to switch to the Spanish channel so then you can hear the translation of what he's going to say. Thank you. Ok, Edison, adelante.
Listo, mil gracias. Bueno, brevemente contarles que Uniminuto es una institución universitaria sin ánimo de lucro. Está orientada a la docencia y a los procesos de proyección social. Además, hace investigación como una función de apoyo y complementaria a la docencia.
La traducción está siendo simultánea, Edison, así que tú continúa hablando, que en paralelo Tasha lo escucha en español.
Nuestro principal propósito, nuestra misión, es promover la inclusión social, el apoyo al desarrollo de los proyectos de vida de los estudiantes y su profesionalización. Ello afecta de manera directa y permanente los proyectos de vida de las comunidades, de las regiones y de la sociedad en general. Tenemos un enfoque claramente centrado en la acción y principalmente nuestro sistema universitario está inspirado en el Evangelio, en el pensamiento de la Iglesia, en la espiritualidad eudista y el carisma del minuto de Dios, que tiene 3 componentes. El primero es ofrecer educación superior de alta calidad y pertinente a todas las personas que no tienen oportunidad de acceder a ella a través de un modelo innovador, integral y flexible. También formar excelentes seres humanos, profesionales competentes, éticamente orientados y comprometidos con la transformación social y el desarrollo sostenible. Y además, contribuir con nuestro testimonio a la construcción de una sociedad fraterna, justa, la reconciliación y la paz. Dentro de nuestras líneas de investigación se cuentan, por ejemplo, las siguientes. las más importantes, y nuestro desarrollo académico está centrado en el desarrollo humano y en el desarrollo social, integral y sostenible. Tenemos líneas de investigación como la educación, transformación social y la innovación, el desarrollo humano, la innovación social y productiva, y la gestión social, la participación y el desarrollo comunitario. En ese sentido, es que acogemos y esperamos que toda la comunidad académica de Uniminuto viva y resalte estos valores que vivimos en Uniminuto, y por esa misma razón consideramos muy oportuno la participación de la doctora Tasha en los dos escenarios planteados. Este que estamos abordando y el próximo escenario que será sobre la transformación social. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, Edison. Y bueno, le doy nuevamente el paso a la persona de comunicación de nuestro equipo, a Pablo Rosso, para que nos haga la introducción a Tasha. Pablo, adelante, por favor.
Vale, muchísimas gracias. Como les mencionaba, este tour de la transferencia social ha tenido como protagonista a nuestra experta de Fulbright, Tasha Howe. Ella es profesora del Departamento de Psicología de Humboldt State University, que está en Arcata, California. Ella es psicóloga de desarrollo que se especializa en la prevención del abuso infantil y psicopatología. Es entrenadora principal del programa para padres de prevención del abuso infantil de la Asociación Americana de Psicología, Act Raising Safe Kids. Su último proyecto es la segunda edición de su libro de texto Marriages and Families in the 21st Century, a Bioecological Approach. Ha trabajado en temas internacionales de bienestar infantil como becaria Fulbright en 3 ocasiones, en 2008 en Chipre, 2014 en Croacia y 2017 en Rusia. A menudo trabaja en el desarrollo y la evaluación de programas, así como en la capacitación de profesionales de primera línea en temas como la neurociencia del trauma y cómo implementar prácticas basadas en evidencia con familias y niños. ¿Listo? Muchas gracias entonces nuevamente a quienes se conectan. Vamos a darle paso entonces a Tasha. Thank you, Tasha, for sharing us another experience, another activity with us. Thank you very much. So you can continue this activity.
Thank you everyone for coming today, and thank you to Rumbo and Fulbright for inviting. I'm going to share my screen. Can everybody see this?
Yes, we can see it.
All right, great. Today I'm going to be talking to you about trauma-informed systems change and also relating this to enhancing community engagement. It was very interesting to hear Edison talking about the values of your university. Our university at Humboldt State also has the same values. And so it's always a challenge to make sure that you're living up to your values and that you're engaging the community in a meaningful way and not exploiting them or not using them for your own research purposes in a way that doesn't benefit them. So I'm going to be talking about how the trauma-informed systems change can not only enhance universities' relationships to the community, but also how it can just enhance the functioning of the university itself, as well as the community at large. So in English, we have a joke about the elephant in the room. And by this joke, we mean that there's something so huge and so obvious sitting right in front of us, but nobody notices it. And so in this cartoon, the elephant is telling his psychiatrist, I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me. So this is kind of how the trauma-informed movement came about. Psychologists, social workers, educators, counselors, everybody knew the pervasive impact of trauma, but nobody was talking about it. Really, Freud was talking about it 100 years ago, but people dismissed him. And so when we read Freud's original works, from 1900, we see so much of what is currently known to be true. We have shown through neuroscience and health and medicine and psychology that many of Freud's ideas about the impact of trauma on the functioning of society was exactly true. And so this has been an elephant in the room for many, many decades. And finally, in about the past 30, 40 years, we've taken it seriously and acknowledged that this elephant in the room must be addressed, or we can never have a sustainable existence for humanity. So why would we want to change everything we do to be trauma-informed? Well, if you don't care about humanity, which both of our universities say we care about humanity, but a lot of times politicians who create the policies only care about money. So the good news is that a trauma-informed lens actually saves money as well as lives. So when we start our journey into a trauma-informed community, we start with training everyone across sectors about the impact of stress and trauma on everyone in society. So that's what I started doing about 20 years ago, is just introducing doctors and police and teachers and pretty much anyone who would listen that trauma is a pervasive influence on the functioning of their staff, their families, themselves, and that it affects the functioning of every organization and agency. So we must train all of the professionals across sectors, across disciplines. Even if you're in something like philosophy or physics, you need to understand how trauma is showing up in your students, in your community members, etc. So professionals need to be trained to understand trauma and be protective influences on helping people recover from trauma. So this would require that we break down silos. Currently, in most countries, each discipline is working in a separate silo and they never talk to each other. So we need all disciplines to work together to understand that trauma-informed reorganization is necessary, and we need to all develop the same vision for what makes a healthy organization, what makes a healthy university, what makes a healthy society. So that when the politicians, when the legislators make new laws and policies, they base them on evidence and not just on politics or personal opinion, which means that they start paying attention to the research and recognize that for every dollar you put into the prevention of trauma, you save $7 to $9 in the long run in things like law enforcement, incarceration, substance abuse treatment, special education, speech therapy, mental health therapy, all of these things that we're willing to pay for after the trauma is a lot more expensive than if we prevented the trauma in the first place. So we really change our focus from intervention to prevention, and we save money and we save lives. So let's look at how we can change our organization, in this case, our university, to be a trauma-informed organization. There's 5 main steps. First, as I mentioned, you have to provide training about trauma and raise awareness about secondary traumatic stress. This means vicarious trauma. So when we're working with traumatized people, such as people in the community or our students, it starts to rub off on us. We start to feel the effects of trauma. So vicarious trauma is happening all the time, especially with professors, because we're hearing about all the stress and all the trauma of hundreds and hundreds of students every year, not to mention our colleagues, things that we're seeing in the environment with political violence. You know, your president's helicopter was just shot at, and the thought of, can someone assassinate the president? Can some protests come and destroy my neighborhood or my business? That kind of stress, even if it doesn't happen directly to you, it starts to become a vicarious trauma. Secondly, we provide opportunities for our employees to explore their own trauma. And so we recognize that probably 60% or more of our colleagues have experienced trauma in their lives. And we provide resources for them to deal with their trauma, such as free counseling, referrals to services, taking retreats. Like I often take my faculty at the beginning of the school year for a nice retreat where we all bring food and we connect with each other. We talk about everything except for work and just try to rejuvenate before the school year starts. The third step is that supervisors need to use reflective supervision. So the old model of supervising employees is that the supervisor's at the top and they look down and tell you if you're doing a good job or not. So it's totally hierarchical. But a trauma-informed supervisory model is bidirectional. And so the supervisors meet regularly with the people who are below them and ask them, how are things going? What can we do to improve your life? Do you see places where we could save money or save time? Do you see ways that we could improve the culture of the organization? So when I meet with my staff every year, I always have this bidirectional conversation. I take their ideas into account and we change systems if possible. And then we need to incentivize a healthy workplace. So we need to provide resources and staff with money, maybe time off. We need to recognize people who are living a healthy lifestyle, providing time in the day for mindfulness, for social connection, and so forth. So one example that we do at our university is we pay every staff member 3 hours a week, and we provide the time for all of the staff to walk around the track together. And so they can do that 3 hours a week with pay. We need to provide strengths-based supervision. So this means we recognize the strengths of everyone we work with, not just the problems they're having, and we include choices. So trauma-informed approaches always give power to the person who has the least power. So when you're working with children or people who are marginalized in society or employees who are lower than you, you need to give them some sense of control and power. So for example, at our university, the staff take 1 month off per year. They're 11-month staff. So I give them the choice of any month they want to take off. I give that to them and they are able to go on their vacations or do whatever they want. So you need to recognize the strengths of everyone you work with and make sure that they know you appreciate those strengths. So this is a total reformation of the traditional hierarchical power model where it's usually men in charge and men are at the top and they make all the decisions. And in the case of multiracial societies, it's usually the whitest men who have the power. So this requires a bit of humility and a bit of recognizing that your power has been unearned. It's been an unearned privilege that mostly white men have had for the preponderance of human history. And so we need to start to think about including other people in the power and in the decision-making of our organization. So these are the things that will help heal trauma in the university, in the workplace, in society, in schools. We need to make sure that people have the opportunity, they have access, they have incentives, and we reward them for having a balanced lifestyle instead of rewarding them for working too much and having no life. So we really need to incentivize balanced nutrition because a healthy diet is related to mental health, not only physical health. The same is true of quality sleep. If you don't sleep enough or of good quality sleep, it actually affects your brain functioning and it affects the hormones in your body and it resets the stress hormones circulating in your stress regulation centers. It also regulates the metabolism of carbohydrates. So people who don't sleep enough are more likely to be overweight and unhealthy because sleep is a reset for all of the bodily systems. We need to provide opportunities and incentives for physical activity, mindfulness practices. In your case, you said you were a religious school. So that's a great type of agency where you can include mindfulness. You can have, 15 minutes a couple times a day where people are allowed to pray, say the rosary, walk around, and just have time of reflection with God. So every agency can have their own type of mindfulness allowances to allow people to reset their brain. Access to nature is very healing and empowering. We see that 15 minutes walking in nature decreases stress hormones. So even if it's just a local dog walking park and you're sitting there for 10 minutes, that's going to be helpful. Providing services for mental health care. And in general, making sure that all of our relationships are supportive so that we're not creating drama, we're not creating gossip, we're not disparaging other people, but we're looking for their strengths and we're looking for ways that we can interact with them. Sometimes it's difficult because sometimes people are really annoying. I have been the department chair of my department for the past 4 years, and 90% of my colleagues are amazing, wonderful, hardworking people. But there's a few that create drama, that are difficult. And I just try as much as I can to see their strengths and to work within their strengths and to tell them about their strengths and to never engage in any kind of drama with them. They keep trying to create the drama, but I don't let it happen. And so it's a very difficult task for some people, but in general, all you can control is your own reaction. You can't control anyone else. So these types of things are usually pretty inexpensive and easy to implement, and you could change the whole functioning of your organization by recognizing the need for a balanced lifestyle. So let's talk a little bit about stress. How much stress can we handle? We've all been going through this pandemic and economic downturn, political violence, COVID, all these things. And is it too much? The question is hard to answer because everybody has a different tolerance for stress based on how they grew up, their childhood traumas, and many other factors. But in general, stress is actually positive for humans. So when we experience stress, we're developing coping skills. We're able to develop ways to handle future stress. We learn from past stress. So in general, stress is positive. It's the normal part of being human, and we all have to live with it. When we move into the yellow stage, that's where things get a little bit more stressful. And so these are things that at the time that they're happening, it feels like we're never going to get over it. It could be death of a loved one, serious illness, maybe a car accident or a natural disaster. You think about the people in Miami right now. going through this building collapse. That seems like something you would never get over if you were in that building and you survived. But they will get over it. Some people will have a harder time than others. But those types of serious stressors, usually we get over them within the average time is about 2 years. If you say got a divorce or something, usually 2 years later, you look back and go, wow, that was really hard. And look what I did. I overcame it. I learned so much about myself. Maybe I made closer relationships with people. So these stressors are also a good test for our system, and we often come out stronger in the end. Where it gets to be more challenging is in toxic stress, where it's just continual, it's constant stress, and our system gets overwhelmed. We don't have time to reflect. We don't have time to learn because it's just never ending. So that toxic stress is very dangerous for the brain, the mind, and the body. So this is how we look at these types of toxic stressors for children. And we call these the adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. These ACEs are things that children experience throughout their childhood or for many years, and they really start to break down their coping skills, or they don't even develop coping skills. So these are things like child abuse, neglect, living with a depressed parent, witnessing domestic violence, being homeless. All of these sorts of things can really be adverse childhood experiences that become toxic stress because you can't escape, you can't cope with it, you don't have support. There are also things in the community that could be adverse experiences, such as poor quality housing, lack of access to water or education, racism, discrimination, violence in the community. These also can become toxic stressors if we experience them over a prolonged period of time. So I've put some stressors that the whole world has experienced together in the left-hand side. So everyone is experiencing COVID. All around the world, we're experiencing racial unrest. All around the world, we're seeing political violence and economic downturn. So will these become toxic stressors, or will these be tolerable stressors where we go, whew, that was hard, and look how we came out the other side, creating a better world, or learning from it and restructuring our healthcare system. Or maybe we've learned something about the types of people we want to elect into the government. We don't know. Some people experience it as a toxic stressor. Many people have committed suicide. In the US, we're seeing so much violence now, gun violence. So is this going to be a toxic stressor? Only the future knows, but it's a great opportunity to try to create a trauma-informed systems change across our systems of financial, emotional, educational, medical, environmental. It's really woken everyone up to climate change. So we'll see what the future holds. But research does tell us that if you have too many of these toxic stressors, they overwhelm the system, and you start to see heart disease, cancer, substance abuse, depression, anxiety. So usually around 4 or more of these, if you experience 4 or more of these, you're more likely to have negative health, mental health, and physical health outcomes. So let's talk a little bit about how this happens. How do these ACEs, or toxic stressors, how do these affect our brain and body? If we look at the diagram on the left, this is the HPA axis, and we can see it's composed of 3 parts: the hypothalamus in the brain, the pituitary gland in the brain, and the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys. This is the system that creates stress hormones that circulate throughout our body, and it regulates our response to stress. So let's take the example of you're walking in the forest and you see a huge snake on the ground and you jump back and you go, oh, there's a snake. So what your brain is doing is telling your body that there's danger. So your eyes need to dilate, your blood needs to start pumping. You need to get your muscles tense so that you can run away, or you can fight the snake, or maybe you can freeze and hope the snake doesn't see you. So it's usually fight or flight or freeze that this system prepares us for. Now, what if you look again and you realize the snake was just a stick on the ground? It was just a piece of wood. Then you start laughing. That was just a stick. That wasn't even a snake. So then your stress regulation center, the HPA axis, calms you down. So you instantly start to have fewer stress hormones and all of your bodily systems go back to normal. So that's why we have this system. We've developed this evolutionary system to help us survive. But when we have that snake there 24 hours a day, when we have constant threats, when we have constant toxic stress, the body cannot go back to normal. So we start to have wear and tear on all of the body systems. We start to have cardiovascular problems, heart disease, high blood pressure. You start to even see brain cells being destroyed in certain parts of the brain. You'll have problems paying attention. You might have eating disorders, eating too much, not eating enough, sleeping problems, sleeping too much, sleeping not enough. It starts to wear down your immune system. So traumatized people have more illnesses and infections. They get more colds and flus, for example. So too much stress starts to destroy all of the bodily systems over a long period of time. The scary part for us meaning those of us who have lived in a traumatic society for many decades or centuries, is that this stress and trauma actually alters our genes. So we experiencing toxic stress experience changes in the regulatory proteins in our DNA. So when we have our genes, it's a little complicated, but it's called methylation. So in this methylation process, people who are traumatized have different methylation patterns in their DNA, which just means certain genes are turned off and on that are different from non-traumatized people. So you actually change your genes and then you can pass that on to the next generation. So this is what we call historic trauma. And many people in many societies around the world have experienced historic trauma. Typically, we see this in indigenous people around the world who have been victims of genocide and trying to take their culture, their language, their arts, their rituals, their religion. We've tried to destroy people around the world. Another example is that the Holocaust survivors, these studies are so interesting. There were Holocaust survivors from the Nazis in World War II who came to the US. So they came to the US, they had children, they had grandchildren. When we look at the genes of their grandchildren who were never in Nazi Germany, were never in a concentration camp, experienced no trauma, their genes are different than the genes of the grandchildren of people who were also in Nazi Germany, but were not in a concentration camp or did not experience massive trauma. So this type of study has been done across many cultures. I can think of other studies where entire generations experience famine, hunger, disease, and their genes are altered to be hyper open to stress, meaning your genetic predisposition is that you're going to be in a state of hyper awareness and you're going to be in a state of anxiety. Your HPA axis is always going to be looking for danger. So these people tend to have higher levels of anxiety and depression. So literally, toxic stress is contagious. And so this is another reason to try to create trauma-informed systems so that we can break this cycle. People tend to think that genes are written when you're born and they can't be altered, but nothing could be further from the truth. Your genes actually turn off and on all day and throughout your lifespan. So this means we can alter those methylation patterns that predispose us to mental health and physical health problems by creating protective and supportive environments for people. You can actually change your genes. So this is a diagram that shows how these genetic changes occur across generations. We're talking about historical trauma. In the US, of course, we have a legacy of slavery, as does most of Latin America. So this legacy of slavery has led to people with darker skin being prejudiced against, discriminated against. Of course, during slavery, there was genocide and all kinds of horrors. And we still have an inequitable society for people with darker skin compared to lighter skin. People with lighter skin get more privileges in society. So let's look at this on the left-hand side of the diagram. You can see that there are parents who experience toxic stress, or parents who had a lot of ACEs in their childhood. So they are creating stress hormones in the blue panel. These stress hormones are affecting their immune system, their metabolic system, as I mentioned, their cardiovascular system, etc. So when these parents have this predisposition to be stressed, that affects their parenting behavior. And when they are trying to get pregnant or have a baby, it affects their ability to conceive. So people with historic trauma or toxic stress or ACEs have difficulty conceiving babies. There are changes to the reproductive system, and there are also changes to the parent's mental and physical health. So then, if you finally get pregnant, in the second gray panel there, you have problems more likely in pregnancy. So people who experience toxic stress, ACEs, or historic trauma have more miscarriages, more complications during pregnancy. They actually have shorter telomeres, which are these caps on the end of our chromosomes that show how healthy we are as a system. So traumatized people have shorter telomeres than non-traumatized people, which means they live on average 7 years less than non-traumatized people. So this telomere shortening can also be improved with intervention. There are studies showing that regular yoga and mindfulness, meditation practices, and exercise can lengthen telomeres. There is also HPA axis dysregulation in the babies before they are born. So they will have more anxiety and more risk of infection and illness before they are born. So then the baby is born and the child has those genetic methylation factors, those genetic predispositions towards stress reactivity. And this affects the child's neuroendocrine system, their HPA axis, their gut, their microbiome, the health of their digestion and their brain development. And it also affects behaviors. So children born to traumatized parents tend to have more behavior problems, such as aggression, not doing well in school, learning disabilities, language delays, depression, anxiety, and so forth. So this is how we pass down trauma from generation to generation. And there are so many cultures around the world where this is happening. So this is another reason why we need trauma-informed systems, because you can actually break the cycle of this historic trauma. So let's talk about how universities, as our workplaces, have been part of this historic trauma. Universities have typically reflected colonialist ideologies and white supremacy. And so they have typically been places for rich white people to go and to exclude other people. And so you can see there in the middle, the Ku Klux Klan, which is a white supremacist group, openly had clubs in most universities in the United States. During the 60s, you can see on the left, the Black Power movement started to show up across universities in the US, and similar movements around the world where people of color and marginalized people, women, indigenous people, and LGBT people started fighting against the system of oppression, and they wanted to be included in universities. And you can see there about forced sterilization of marginalized people, which happened in many cultures because of the ideologies of social Darwinism, where people felt that we could sterilize undesirable genetic lines and continue desirable genetic lines. So historically, universities did not really want to engage with the surrounding communities. Universities were originally developed by religious orders, and they felt that the surrounding communities were savage and morally corrupt. So these campuses were built on top of mountains or in rural isolated areas with beautiful nature, ample food. Students were allowed to live there, and the religious leaders were thinking that they would educate the highest genetic pool of society and keep that from being polluted by the regular people in the community. In the United States in 1862, the government gave 30,000 acres of federal land to build universities in every state. And these universities are called land-grant universities, and I work at one. And part of this agreement was that if the federal government gives you this land, you must provide service to the public. You cannot just be an isolated, elitist organization. Most universities felt that this was an obligation that they had to fulfill on paper just to make the government happy, and they really were not interested in doing it. And today, many universities still feel this way. They still judge the local community as savage or uneducated or in some way flawed, and they have a colonialist mindset about working with the community. In the US today, 90% of universities have an Office of Community Engagement, but only 1/3 have actual community members working there. And so there's high staff turnover. Many universities still have a colonialist mindset. Students are sent out into the community to help, quote, those people, or professors do research to develop their own research interests. And so it turns out that the university does things to the community, and sometimes they ask the community for approval, and sometimes they change a few things, but not always. Can I ask the moderators, I see that it's 9:27 and we were supposed to end at 9:30, but we didn't actually get started until 8:50. Can I ask you what I should do about the timing?
Edison,
Claro que sí.
sí, ok.
Yo le pediría el favor a la doctora Tasha que tomémonos unos 4 o 5 minutos y hagamos una conclusión general para no cortar tan de sopetón el tema, porque está muy interesante y hay unas preguntas en el chat. Y le pediría entonces a la doctora Tasha que por favor continuara por 4 o 5 minutos más, tratar de dándole final a la conferencia.
Claudia, no sé si tú le estás traduciendo esto a Tasha o te ayudo.
I don't have my translation on. Can you just tell me if I need to stop?
Okay. Well, they need you to do 5 more minutes of your lecture. So and also they have some questions to share, so you can continue, but making it to the closure, so we can do the other activity.
Okay, well, we didn't start until 8:50, so I have a
Yeah.
lot more, and I think we should just end if they want to open it up for questions.
Okay. Edison, ¿pudiste escuchar Natasha?
Sí, claro que sí. Bueno, de acuerdo. Y en el marco pues, de las preguntas, tratar de abordar lo que haya quedado, digamos, en la presentación, si estás de acuerdo. Gracias.
Vale, okay. So Tasha, I'm going to share the question, so maybe you can switch to the translation channel, so Claudia can translate the questions, and I'm going to share it in Spanish to all the audience, right? Okay. Bueno, como les mencionábamos, vamos a hacer unas preguntas. Les pedimos que quienes no hayan compartido todavía sus preguntas la puedan hacer a través de la sección preguntas y respuestas para que nos quede más fácil poderlas compartir. Ricardo de acá de Uniminuto pues nos comparte esta pregunta. ¿Cómo evitar los traumas? ¿Hay técnicas para sanar? Las universidades pueden desarrollar programas para la atención del trauma con el objetivo de mejorar el desempeño y el clima laboral.
So, one person is asking how to avoid trauma.
So there's no way to avoid it because it's part of humanity. But those stress busters that I showed are a lot of the ways that we can start healing, and the way that I talked about trauma-informed systems change is how we can start healing. But we can prevent it in the next generation by applying what we've learned. Yes, if you implement those strategies that I talked about, that's the point of what we're doing here is trauma-informed systems change. The second half of my presentation was more in the concrete examples, but we ran out of time.
Vale, ahora vamos a leer esta pregunta que nos envía Juan Castañeda. Él pregunta, en caso de víctimas del conflicto armado, se han presentado eventos vitales estresantes muy fuertes como abuso sexual, minas antipersonas, etcétera. La ley pide reparación integral. ¿Qué tipo de reparación para el trauma recomiendas para este tipo de víctimas, como ocurre en el caso colombiano?
Well, you need to stop doing what you've been doing for a few hundred years. Recognizing and acknowledging what you've done. And provide inclusive education and services for everyone. I was going to present what we've done with Indigenous communities in my area. Where we've given back 20,000 acres of land where we massacred them in 1860. And now we ask them what they need, and we try to develop partnerships with them for a beginning to the healing of the trauma we inflicted upon them. So you need to ask them what they need and not just assume that you know what they need, but create a needs assessment and make them partners in whatever you're doing.
Vale, tenemos una última pregunta y es relacionada un poco bajo esta misma línea. Tasha nos mencionaba que hay un recorrido histórico de las universidades donde no hay un compromiso real con sus comunidades. ¿Qué deben hacer las universidades para reparar también esta relación exclusiva que han tenido ciertas universidades con su entorno?
That was the second half of my presentation, so I can't really summarize it right now, but basically you need to ask them what they need and create partnerships so that it's not you doing something to them, but you creating authentic relationships.
Bueno, Edison, yo creo que por cuestiones de tiempo, creo que ya esas son como las preguntas que podemos socializar. No sé si quieras compartir algo más e invitar a nuestros asistentes a la segunda actividad.
Juan, muchísimas gracias. Entonces, ya para finalizar, quisiéramos agradecerle sus respuestas, la presentación que hace la doctora Tasha. Quisiéramos agradecerle también a, a nuestros asistentes y a nuestros panelistas y amablemente invitarlos al siguiente espacio donde se socializarán las experiencias de investigación y de pronto 3 o 4 proyectos que quisiéramos contarle a la doctora Tasha para recibir sus impresiones.
Do I need to log out or just stay here?
Yeah, Tasha. Well, we're going to do so. The
Tenemos
closure of...
un link especial para la segunda conexión, entonces creo que debemos hacerlo por el segundo enlace.
Vale. Yeah, Tasha, I think we're going to do the closure of this lecture, and there's going to be a new link to our Zoom. So, muchas gracias a quienes se han conectado aquí al Zoom, a nuestra transmisión a través de YouTube. Como lo mencionaba Edison, pues ahora va a haber una presentación de algunos proyectos en un minuto para la doctora Tasha. Si nos desean acompañar, ya les enviaremos un enlace de Zoom para que se puedan conectar también a esta segunda actividad que organiza Uniminuto para el Tour de la Transferencia Social. ¿Listo? Muchas gracias a todos. La dinámica va a ser casi que la misma en cuanto a Zoom o al streaming y ya nos veremos. Muchas gracias.
Y gracias a todos. Invitados a que continúen el siguiente.